Hello and welcome to this podcast from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is one of this country's finest novelists and playwrights, as well as an astute critic and accomplished translator from Russian. But Michael Frayn began his writing career as a journalist in the Manchester Guardian, and Faber have just published Travels with a Typewriter, a collection of his finest travel pieces, which he wrote as a freelance in the 1960s and 70s. His destinations range from Paris and Berlin to Israel, America and Cuba, and everywhere Frayn's shrewd, quizzical gaze is turned on the stuff of everyday life. He writes in his preface that the pieces in this book mean a lot to him. I asked him to tell me more about the significance they hold.
I wrote them at a time of my life when things were changing. I'd been writing a humorous column for first The Guardian and then The Observer, and I decided I was getting rather set in my ways and that I should go back to do some reporting. I'd begun my career as a reporter on The Guardian, and as I say in the introduction, I sometimes feel that all writers who write fiction ought to be required by law occasionally to go back and do a bit of reporting, just to remind them of how unlike what they imagine the world to be, the world actually is. It's very complicated. There's an awful lot of stuff out there in the world, and it's arranged in a very complicated way. And disentangling it and describing it is extremely difficult. So I wanted to get out of my study and go back to the world.
What was it like going back to them? I presume you hadn't looked at many of them in the intervening 40 or so years, 30 or 40 years. So what was it like going back and rediscovering them 30 or 40 years on?
It was rediscovering an early part of my own life, but also rediscovering the world as it was back in the 70s. And an awful lot of things have changed since then. One of the pieces is about Berlin. And when I wrote that, Berlin was a divided city, and it didn't seem as if it's ever going to change. I think the single most surprising political event that's occurred in my lifetime is the opening of the Berlin Wall and the removal of the Berlin Wall. And to go back to the world as it was before that happened it's quite a shock.
And when you were writing the pieces, did you have more or less carte blanche where you went, or were you being sent, or could you choose where you wanted to go?
No, I was given really absolute carte blanche, but also some very good assistance and advice in choosing subjects. The Berlin article in particular, I told David Astor, who was then the editor of The Observer, that I wanted to write about Germany, but I couldn't see how to. I'd never been to Germany, and I begun to get rather intrigued by it, and I wanted to write about it and couldn't see how to focus it. And he said, go to Berlin, because the whole German situation is focused in one single city there, because the city is divided like the whole country. And I did go. I was absolutely stunned by Berlin. My imagination was completely caught by it. And it was the beginning of my fascination with Germany, which has continued. Found out a lot more about it since, travelled a lot more widely in Germany, and written quite a lot about Germany one way and another.
So travel, going back to what you were saying about novelists being required to get out there and see the world, the travel has actually influenced the direction of your thought and therefore your other writing since.
Yes, there's several fictions I've written which have been based on travel. One of my early novels was called The Russian Interpreter, and that was based not on doing reporting, but a trip that I made as a student to Russia. Some friends and I, who all spoke Russian, got up what I think was the very first student exchange, and went. They would only let us in for a month. We spent a month at Moscow University. This was back in 1956, and it was that was a great eye opener. And then one of the articles in the book is about Cuba, and I based a play on Cuba called Clouds. And I suppose Democracy, my play about Willy Brandt, comes out of all my travels in Germany. It does bring you, going to write about some unfamiliar place does open your eyes and does refresh your perception, and makes you start thinking about things again.
Even if this is not explicit, I think there's, reading these pieces from the late 60s and the early 70s, there's a kind of implicit comparison, it seemed to me, between what life is like in Great Britain and what life is like overseas. So you're sort of testing what it means to live in Sweden or Austria or Germany, and sort of thinking, how does this compare to life back home? Then one point where it is explicit is where you come back from Sweden. You've been sort of thinking about the Swedish model, and you encounter a train strike, I think, and lots of things are not working, and so that there it sort of becomes explicit. But were you sort of in those days sort of thinking, well, what is it like to be Viennese today compared to living in London?
Yes, I think one of the intentions with all the pieces was to write about the most ordinary aspects of life in the places I visited. Most journalism, very reasonably, is about the extraordinary. It's about the tragic and the terrible, or sometimes the wonderful. But it's about things that are out of the ordinary. And I think sometimes there's a point in writing articles about life as it is for most people most of the time in the place, because by definition most things in most people's lives are not extraordinary, but that's what extraordinary means. So I was trying to concentrate on what it was just like being an ordinary person arriving in some ordinary place, and seeing what was in front of his eyes.
And you're very honest about the fact that the big picture is sometimes difficult to grasp. I think in the instance of Cuba, you say that sometimes you think it's going in one direction, and other times you think it may be going the other direction. It's difficult to actually say this works or this doesn't work when you're talking about something as complex as a whole society.
Well, specifically when I went to Cuba, I thought everyone's got views about Cuba. They either think it's a wonderful, hopeful experiment, or they think it's a disaster. I'm going to go without any preconceptions. I'm just going to look and describe what I see and not try to come to any general conclusions. But I found it was impossible. Every day, what I saw suggested a general picture, and I began to feel cheerful and optimistic and think, yeah, things are not bad here, things are working. And then the next day, a few things go wrong, and I see some really terrible things, and I think, this is a terrible place. It's an absolute dump. And I found it very difficult to detach myself from any general feeling about the place. But all I can hope is that the sequence of general pictures that I had as I went through Cuba to some extent balance each other out.